Rain hammered the tin roof of the Whitfield house like fists against a door that would not open, and inside, by the light of a single guttering lamp, Isul Yoon knelt over a woman who was dying by inches. Margaret Whitfield's scream tore through the storm. Blood soaked the sheets, the child turned wrong inside her, and the town doctor stood useless in the doorway, hands shaking too hard to help. Isul did not look up. She had one question left. Would her hands be enough? Or would Larkspur Crossing bury the two lives it had ever mattered to?
Push through the pain. He is almost here.
3 seasons earlier, the same town had stood outside the church and laughed her name into the dirt. They called her foreign, they called her barren, they called her a curse dressed in borrowed calico, and not one of them had lowered a hand to help her lift her own fallen firewood from the road. She had learned by then to keep her chin level and her eyes dry because the frontier did not reward a woman's tears, only her endurance, and endurance was the one inheritance nobody could take from her. Then a rancher the whole territory feared for the men he'd buried had stepped between her and the crowd, quiet as a closing door, and said the 6 words that would undo everything Larkspur Crossing believed about both of them. Nobody in that square had known his own house held a grave he never spoke of, a grief bricked up so long it had turned to iron. Nobody had known that the woman they scorned as barren carried a grief that matched his, breath for breath, wound for wound. By the night Margaret Whitfield screamed into that storm, Isul Yoon and Rourke Calder had already traded silences no one else could translate, but none of it, not the debt, not the defense, not the slow thaw between 2 guarded hearts, explained why her hands were the only ones steady enough to save a dying woman the town had once said didn't deserve her help. To understand that, you have to go back to the morning they called her barren to her face, on the steps of a church that wouldn't let her inside. Woe. Frost had crept through the seams of Isil Yoon's only pair of gloves before the sun ever cleared the ridge, and still she knelt in the hard dirt behind her cabin, breaking ground that refused, season after season, to give her anything green. 2 winters had passed since the homestead papers named her the rightful holder of 40 acres she had never asked to inherit, and 2 winters had passed since Larkspur Crossing decided, without a single vote taken, that a Korean woman alone on that land was a wrongness to be managed rather than a neighbor to be welcomed. She rose only when her knees could bear no more, wiped her palms on an apron gone gray from washing, and looked toward town the way a person looks toward weather they cannot avoid. There was flour to buy, there was thread. There was, if she was honest with herself, a hunger for a voice that was not her own murmured prayers over the vegetable rows. She walked the 2 miles into Larkspur Crossing, with her basket on her arm, and her spine set the way her grandmother had taught her to carry herself through a market that did not want her custom. The general store fell quiet when the bell over the door rang for her. Mrs. Odalie Marsh, who ran the counter as though she had been ordained to it, watched Isul cross the floorboards and did not move to help her find the flour sack she needed. Behind her, 2 women who sold eggs on Saturdays exchanged a look that Isul had learned, painfully, not to misunderstand. She paid for what she came for. She did not linger. Outside, on the church steps where the town's better families gathered before the noon service, someone had left a crate of squash for the harvest table, and a boy of perhaps 10 pointed at her basket and asked, loud enough to carry, if the barren woman had finally grown something that wasn't weeds. His mother did not correct him. She laughed low and satisfied, the kind of laugh that told Isul the word barren had traveled through this town long before she'd ever heard it spoken to her face, following her from house to house like a dog that had been fed once and never forgotten the hand. Isul kept walking. She had buried a fiancé she barely knew before their wedding could take place, buried a country's worth of expectations along with him, and built, out of nothing but stubbornness and a dead man's 40 acres, a life the town refused to recognize as one. She told herself, as she always did, that dignity did not require an audience. But on the far side of the square, past the hitching post, a stranger on a black horse had stopped to watch the whole exchange without once looking away. and something in the stillness of him made her wonder, for the first time in 2 years, if someone in Larkspur Crossing had finally seen her. The stranger did not approach her that day, and by the time his soul reached the edge of town, with her basket balanced against her hip, she had convinced herself she'd imagined the particular quality of his attention. It was easier, she had found, to imagine nothing at all than to hope for something Larkspur Crossing was unlikely to offer twice. She thought, instead of her grandmother's hands, of the herbs pressed and dried in paper twists back home in the province she would never see again, of the births she had watched as a girl, standing just behind her grandmother's shoulder, memorizing the rhythm of breath and blood the way other girls memorize psalms. That knowledge had value nowhere in this territory except in the dark, when a rancher's wife went into early labor with no doctor for 20 miles, and a neighbor, ashamed, came knocking at Isil's door after midnight and left before dawn so no one would see whose child had truly saved whose life. She never spoke of those nights. The women she helped never spoke of them either, not in daylight, not on the church steps where Ottilie Marsh presided over gossip like a magistrate over a courtroom. It was Ottilie who found her again that same afternoon, waiting by the well with 2 of her circle. And it was Ottilie who asked, in a voice pitched to travel exactly as far as it needed to, whether a woman who could grow nothing, bear nothing, and keep no husband ought to be trusted near anyone's harvest at all. The words barren and foreign arrived in the same breath, as they so often did, as though the 2 were simply different names for the same defect. Isil set her basket down at the lip of the well, and let the silence stretch long enough that even Ottilie's companions shifted their weight, uncertain now that the joke had landed exactly where it was meant to. Then she drew water, filled her jug without spilling a drop, and said only that the ground gave what the ground was given, in Korean under her breath, a phrase her grandmother used for gardens and for grief in the same tone. She did not translate it for them. She did not owe them the meaning of anything that was hers. Walking home with the jug heavy on her hip, she passed the hitching post again and found it empty, the black horse gone, and told herself that whatever she had felt in that stranger's stillness had likely been nothing more than a man deciding whether her land was worth the trouble of a low offer. Still, she found herself glancing back once, twice at the road behind her, half hoping and wholly unwilling to admit it, that Larkspur Crossing held one person left, who had not yet decided what she was worth before ever asking her name. The letter came by the same writer who carried the territory's mail twice a month, and Isil recognized the bank's seal before she'd even broken it, because she had been dreading this particular shape of paper since the day the county recorder first hesitated over her name. Her fiancé, Thomas Reyes, had died of a fever the week she arrived, before any wedding, before any legal bond a territorial court would recognize as more than a rumor, and the only reason she still held the 40 acres at all was a hastily amended will, and a circuit judge too tired to argue with a dead man's wishes. The bank in the county seat had never much liked that arrangement. Now, with the note on the land, 3 payments behind, and a harvest thinner than any she'd managed yet, they wanted a debt of $140 paid in full by the first frost, or the deed reverted, clean and legal, to whoever the bank chose to sell it to. Next. Isil read the letter twice at her kitchen table, once for the numbers, and once for the particular cruelty of watching 2 years of blistered hands reduced to a sum she did not have, and could not, by any honest means available to a woman alone, earn before the ground froze. She thought of selling the mule. She thought of the jar of coins buried under the floorboard, counted them in her head, and knew before she lifted the boards that it would not be enough. She thought, too, of walking into the bank herself and asking for time, and dismissed the thought within the same breath, because she had watched how the clerk's eyes moved over her the one time she'd gone in to ask after her fiancé's account, cataloging her the way a man catalogs livestock he suspects might be diseased. There was no dignity to be found begging a stranger for mercy he had already decided she didn't deserve. She banked the stove low that night to save wood she couldn't afford to burn freely, and sat a long while in the dark, doing the arithmetic of loss the way her grandmother had once done the arithmetic of famine, dividing what little remained by however many days it needed to last. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and rattled the shutter she had never gotten around to fixing, and somewhere past the tree line, a horse nickered, once, in a way that did not belong to any animal she owned. She told herself it was nothing. She had told herself that before, about a stranger and a stillness that had followed her all the way home from the well. The knock came 3 days later, in the gray hour before proper morning, and when Isolde opened the door with the fire poker half raised behind her skirt, she found the rancher from the hitching post, standing on her step with his hat already in his hand, as though he had rehearsed the courtesy the whole ride over. He introduced himself as Rourke Calder of the Calder Spread on the North Range, and told her plainly, without the softening most men in this territory thought a woman required, that he had bought her note from the bank that morning for the full amount owed. He did not frame it as charity. He said the words like a man closing a business transaction he had already decided was fair, and when Isolde's spine went rigid at the implication of being purchased along with her land, he was quicker than she expected, to correct the shape of it. The debt was hers to repay however she chose, in coin or in kind, and he had a proposal that cost her nothing but her skill. His ranch hands worked hard country with no doctor, closer than 3 days' ride, and injuries came the way weather came, without warning and without mercy. He had heard, from more than one grateful and tight-lipped neighbor, that her hands knew things the territory's one doctor did not. He was offering wages for that knowledge, fair wages, paid monthly, enough to clear the note within 2 seasons if she wished it. Isolde studied him across the threshold for a long moment, weighing the offer against every instinct that told her nothing. This town produce came without a hidden cost attached, but there was no smugness in his face, no cataloging look like the bank clerks, only a kind of careful, guarded patience, as though he too had learned the hard way what it cost to be misread by people who had already made up their minds. She asked him why. Not what he wanted in return, but why a man who by every account kept the whole territory at arm's length would spend $140 on a woman he'd exchanged perhaps 10 words with. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all, and when he finally spoke, it was only to say that he knew what it cost a person to lose everything to a debt that was never truly theirs to begin with, and that he did not intend to watch it happen twice. Then he set his hat back on his head, told her he'd send a wagon Monday, and rode off before she could ask what, in his own life, he was counting as the first time. The Harvest Social was the one occasion each year when Larkspur Crossing pretended, for a single evening, to be the kind of town that welcomed everyone within its boundary. And Isolde had learned to attend it anyway, because absence was its own kind of confession, and she refused to hand her neighbors that particular satisfaction. She wore the one good dress she owned, dark green wool with a collar she'd embroidered herself in a pattern half Korean and half whatever she'd picked up from the church quilting circle that tolerated her presence if not her company, and she stood near the punch table with her hands folded, watching the dancing the way a person watches a language they understand but are never invited to speak. Rourke Calder arrived late, as he always did, and the room's temperature seemed to drop half a degree the way it did whenever he entered a space full of people who owed him money or feared his reputation, or both. He crossed to where Isolde stood without any particular haste, said good evening in a voice pitched only for her, and asked, with a formality that made her want to laugh for the first time in weeks, Whether she would permit him a dance, he had no talent whatsoever for performing. She had just placed her hand in his when Adelia Marsh's voice cut across the music, bright and cruel and pitched for the whole room to hear, wondering aloud whether Mr. Calder understood the sort of company he was keeping. A barren foreign woman who couldn't be bothered to marry properly even when death handed her the chance. The music did not stop, but every conversation near enough to hear did, and Isul felt the old familiar heat crawl up her throat, the urge to shrink smaller than the insult, to disappear into the wallpaper the way she had disappeared into 100 rooms before this one. Rourke did not let go of her hand. He turned, slow and deliberate, and looked at Ottilie Marsh with an expression that had, by more than one account, once made an armed man reconsider his evening, and said, loud enough that the fiddler faltered mid-note, that he had buried better company than hers and slept easier for it, and that the next person in this town who spoke to Isil Yoon the way she had just spoken would be settling accounts with him personally, land or no land, friend or no friend. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and unfamiliar, the sound of an entire room recalculating what it thought it knew. Ottilie's face went the color of raw meat, and she said nothing further. Rourke turned back to Isul, offered his hand again as though nothing at all had happened, and asked, quietly this time, only for her, whether she'd still permit him that dance. She danced with him because refusing would have handed Ottilie Marsh a smaller victory dressed up as a larger one, and because, beneath the mortification still burning in her chest, some other feeling had lodged itself there too, something she did not yet have a word for in either of her languages. His hand at her waist was careful in a way that had nothing to do with the dance steps he clearly did not know, careful the way a man is careful with something he suspects has already been broken once and does not intend to be the one who breaks it again. Neither of them spoke through the whole of the song. When it ended, he walked her back to the punch table, thanked her with a small, formal bow that seemed to embarrass him more than it did her, and left the social early, the way he always did, disappearing into the dark before anyone could corner him with the questions his outburst had surely earned. Isul stayed another hour out of pure stubbornness, accepted a stiff, grudging nod from two women who had never so much as looked at her directly before that night, and walked home under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost wasteful, thinking the whole way about the particular grief she had heard, buried under his anger, a grief that had nothing to do with her land or her debt or anything she had said or done. Buried better company than hers, he had told the whole room, and slept easier for it. That was not a phrase a man reached for lightly. That was a phrase carved out of an actual loss, specific enough to have a name, and Isul found herself wondering, as she banked her stove and lay down in the dark, what exactly Rourke Calder had buried, and why a stranger's cruelty about barrenness had struck a nerve raw enough to make a guarded man forget himself in front of the whole territory. She thought of the black horse standing alone at the hitching post the day Ottilia had first cornered her at the well. She thought of the ranch house on the North Range that, by every account, he kept shuttered and half-empty despite owning the largest spread in 3 counties. Something in that house, she suspected, was the answer to a question she hadn't yet earned the right to ask him directly. 2 seasons of wages toward her debt, she reminded herself, sliding toward sleep. 2 seasons of proximity to a man who had just, in front of the entire town, chosen her, publicly and without hedging, over people he had known his whole life. She did not know yet whether that was a mercy or a complication. She suspected, drifting off, that it might well be both. The wagon came for her Monday as promised, driven by a ranch hand named Dutch, who talked enough for 2 men and seemed grateful, in his own roundabout way, for anyone willing to listen to him do it. And by the 2nd week, Isul had settled into a rhythm at the Calder spread that felt, disorientingly, like the closest thing to belonging she'd known since crossing the ocean. She treated blistered palms and a mule-kicked shin, and, on the worst afternoon of that first month, a young hand named Pete Sorensen, who'd been thrown from a green colt and dragged 8 feet with his boot caught in the stirrup before anyone could reach him. His arm had broken clean through, the bone pressing white against skin gone the color of ash, and the men who carried him in were already talking in low, resigned voices about the 3 days it would take to fetch a proper doctor and whether the arm would even be worth saving by then. Isul sent Dutch for boiling water, cleared the bunkhouse table with one sweep of her arm, and set the bone herself, working by lamplight with a steadiness that made even the hardened men in the doorway go quiet. She packed the break with a poultice her grandmother had used on a fisherman's shattered wrist decades earlier, splinted it with barrel staves Dutch fetched at a run, and stayed through the worst of the boy's fever that followed, cooling his forehead with a cloth soaked in the well water Rourke himself hauled up, bucket after bucket, without being asked. Neither of them spoke much during those hours. There was a kind of communication that happened anyway, in the passing of a cloth, the refilling of a basin, the way he watched her hands work and adjusted his own movements a half-second ahead of what she needed before she'd asked for it, as though some part of him had done this exact vigil before and remembered its choreography in his bones. Near dawn, when Pete's fever finally broke and his breathing evened into something like sleep, Rourke sat back against the wall across from her, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and said quietly that he hadn't seen anyone work a wound like that since he was a boy back east, before the war took his father and sent what remained of the family west with nothing but a wagon and a debt. It was the first personal thing he had ever told her. Isul, bone-tired and strangely undone by the smallness of the offering, told him in return about her grandmother's garden of dried herbs, the paper twists of yarrow and mugwort she'd carried across an ocean in a tin box that still smelled, faintly, of the province she would never see again. He listened the way almost no one in this territory ever had, as though her past were a country worth visiting, rather than a defect to be managed. After that night, something between them shifted into a register. Neither of them named aloud, but both of them understood. A habit of finding reasons to end the working day standing at the same fence rail, watching the light go copper over the western range while the day's heat bled slowly out of the ground. Isul found herself telling him things she had not told anyone since her grandmother died, about the crossing that had taken 11 weeks and claimed, among other losses too large to speak of even now, a child she had carried and lost somewhere in the gray middle of that ocean, before Larkspur Crossing had ever had the chance to call her Barren and be, in its own cruel and ignorant way, half correct about a grief it knew nothing of. She told him this on an evening in late autumn, her voice steady only because she had practiced keeping it that way for 2 years, and watched something move behind his eyes that she recognized instantly as a mirror of her own old wound, though he said nothing in reply beyond a low, rough sound that might have been her name, or might have been nothing at all. She did not press him. She had learned, from the inside of her own silence, exactly how much a person could bear to give away before the giving became a wound reopened rather than a burden shared. But 2 evenings later, standing at that same fence rail while Dutch's youngest, a girl of 6 who'd taken to trailing Isul around the yard like a devoted shadow, ran laughing past them, chasing a barn cat, Rourke's whole body went rigid in a way Isul had never seen, his jaw locking, his hand tightening on the fence rail until his knuckles whitened against the wood. She asked carefully, what was wrong? He said nothing was wrong. He said it too fast, in a voice gone suddenly hollow, and excused himself to check on a horse that did not need checking on, leaving Isul alone at the rail, with the girl's laughter still ringing across the yard, and a new, sharper shape to the question she had been carrying since the harvest social. It was not simply grief he carried inside that shuttered ranch house. It was grief attached, specifically and unbearably, to the sound of a child's laughter, to the particular register of joy that belonged in some house she had never been allowed to see, to a family he no longer had. She walked home that night, past the small fenced plot near the eastern tree line she had noticed once before, and assumed, without asking, was simply a place for burying livestock. She was no longer certain that was what it was. So, curiosity was not a virtue his soul had been raised to indulge, but grief recognized grief the way water finds its own level, and 3 days after the incident at the fence rail, she found herself walking the long way home past the fenced plot beneath the cottonwoods, telling herself she only wanted to see whether the fence needed mending before winter. It did not need mending. It was, in fact, the best-kept structure on the entire Calder spread, whitewashed fresh enough that the smell of lime still clung faintly to the wood. The grass inside, clipped shorter than any pasture grass, had any practical reason to be. There were 2 markers inside the fence, not one. The larger stone, weathered but legible, read Naomi Calder, beloved wife, and beneath the name, a single line of scripture, worn nearly smooth by 3 winters of hands that had clearly returned again and again to trace the letters. The second marker was smaller, plain, unlettered, but for a single carved date that told Isolde everything the stone itself refused to say directly. A date that fell the same day as the larger one. A birth and a death recorded in the same breath, on the same afternoon, in a house not 200 yards from where she now stood, with her hand pressed flat against the cold top rail of the fence. She did not need Dutch's talkative company or the church quilting circle's gossip to understand, standing there in the fading light, exactly what shape of grief lived behind Rourke Calder's guarded eyes, and exactly why the laughter of Dutch's small daughter had driven him, wordless, out of a conversation he could not finish. She thought of her own loss, the one she had finally spoken aloud at that same fence rail days before, and felt something in her chest crack open wider than it had in 2 years, not with pity, which she suspected he would refuse the way she herself refused it, but with a recognition so total it left her briefly unable to move. She did not know the particulars yet. She did not know why the doctor in town, the same Edmund Whitfield, whose wife she would one day be summoned to save, had not been there in time, or whether time had even been the variable that mattered. But she understood, standing at that small fence in the cottonwood shade, with dusk coming down soft and gray around her, that Rourke Calder's coldness toward this town was not temperament. It was architecture, built stone by stone over 3 winters of grief, with nowhere honest to set it down. And she found herself wondering, walking the rest of the way home in the dark, whether a man could ever fully put down a weight like that, or whether the best anyone could offer him was simply the company of someone willing to help him carry it. She got the rest of it from Dutch 3 evenings later, not because she asked directly, but because Dutch was a man who filled silences the way water fills a low place in the ground, without particular intention, simply because the shape of the world demanded it. They were mending a section of corral fence together, and when Isolde's eyes drifted, without her quite meaning them to, toward the cottonwood plot in the distance, Dutch followed her gaze and went quiet in a way that was, for him, more eloquent than speech. Then he told her, in the careful sideways manner of a man handling something fragile that belonged to someone else, about the winter 3 years back when Naomi Calder's time had come early and hard, a full month before anyone expected it. In the worst blizzard the territory had seen in a decade, Rourke had ridden for Dr. Whitfield himself, twice through drifts that should have killed a lesser horseman, and both times the doctor had refused to leave his own warm parlor for a homestead wife. With, in his own recorded words, to the man who'd later repeated them to half the county, no proper standing in town, society worth risking a man's life in a blizzard for. Naomi had not been wealthy. She had not been a founding family's daughter. She had been, by Dutch's careful account, a sharecropper's girl from the wrong side of the river, whom Rourke had married for love against his own family's objections. And Larkspur Crossing had never quite forgiven either of them for the insult of that choice. When the doctor finally rode out, 2 days after the storm broke, there had been nothing left for him to save. Rourke had delivered his own son alone, in a farmhouse gone silent except for his own hands and his own voice, and had buried them both himself, in ground he chose and fenced and kept, ever since, better than he kept anything else he owned. Dutch finished the story and went back to his fence post, as though he'd said nothing more remarkable than a note on the weather. But Isol stood a long moment with the hammer slack in her hand, understanding now, in full, why a man who had watched a town's prejudice cost him everything had stood in a crowded dance hall and told an entire room he'd bury better company than theirs, and mean every syllable of it. She understood, too, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that if Larkspur Crossing's cruelty could ever again dress itself up as medicine and refuse to ride out for a woman it judged unworthy, she would not stand by and let it happen twice under the same sky. She did not tell him what Dutch had said. It felt somehow like a theft to carry a story that heavy into a conversation without giving the person who owned it the choice of whether to hand it over himself. And so, instead, on a cold evening in early winter, when he found her still at the ranch house kitchen table long after the day's work was done, mending a tear in Pete Sorensen's shirt sleeve by lamplight, she simply asked him, quietly, to tell her about Naomi, if he ever wanted to. She expected refusal. She had watched him retreat from smaller openings than that one, seen the shutters come down behind his eyes at gentler questions. Instead, he sat across from her, turned his hat slowly in his hands the way a man turns something he's deciding whether to set down for good, and told her, in a voice stripped of all its usual guardedness, about a sharecropper's daughter, with a laugh that had made the whole valley seem less hard for the 2 years he'd known her. About a family who'd disowned him for marrying beneath what they considered his station. About a blizzard that arrived a month too early, and a doctor who had weighed her worth against his own comfort and found her wanting. He told her about riding out twice into that storm, about the second refusal delivered from a doorway warm with firelight, while his wife labored alone in a house he could not reach fast enough. He told her, at the very end, in a voice that finally broke on the words, about the son he had named Ezra after his own father, born and lost within the same silent hour, and about fencing that small plot the following spring with his own hands, because he could not bear the thought of cattle wandering carelessly over the only proof that either of them had ever existed. Isol reached across the table and set her hand over his, not speaking, because she understood by now, from the inside of her own grief, that comfort offered too quickly could feel like a demand that the pain resolve itself for someone else's comfort rather than his own. He turned his hand beneath hers and held on, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, the lamp burning low between them, the wind working at the shutters outside. Two people who had each buried something the world refused to properly mourn, finally allowing another person to stand at the graveside with them. Word of Margaret Whitfield's condition reached the ranch the way most news reached the ranch. Second-hand and slightly wrong, carried out from town by Dutch, after a supply run, with the particular relish of a man who enjoyed being first to deliver anything. The doctor's own wife was expecting, he reported, her first after 11 years of marriage and, by the church circles whispered arithmetic, at an age the town's matrons considered dangerously late for a first labor. Rourke's jaw tightened at the news in a way Isol had learned to read as clearly as any spoken sentence, and she watched him carry that tension out to the barn and work it off against a fence post that did not, by any honest measure, need the repairs he gave it that afternoon. She understood, without his having to explain it, the particular cruelty folded into this piece of news that the same doctor who had let his own wife die in a blizzard rather than treat a sharecropper's daughter would now presumably spare no expense or urgency for his own family's sake, and that if anything went wrong, the whole apparatus of the town's sympathy and resource would turn out for Margaret Whitfield in a way it had never once turned out for Naomi Calder. Isel carried her own quieter unease alongside his, though she said nothing of it that evening because voicing it felt too much like tempting the exact outcome she feared. Adelie Marsh, meanwhile, had not softened toward her, despite the dance hall humiliation, had in fact grown sharper in the weeks since, stopping just short of open insult, but making certain, through 100 small unkindnesses, that Isol understood her presence in Larkspur Crossing remained conditional and closely watched. There was talk, Dutch mentioned once, careful not to look at either of them as he said it, of the church board debating whether a woman living and working so closely with an unmarried rancher, whatever the arrangement's official terms, reflected well on the town's moral character. Isol heard the warning under the gossip clearly enough. She was tolerated only so long as she remained useful and distant, a healer to be summoned in emergency and scorned in daylight. And she understood, walking home under a sky heavy with the year's first real snow, that whatever peace she had found at the fence rail with Rourke Calder existed inside a town that had not, despite everything, finished deciding what to do with her. The blizzard that came for Margaret Whitfield's labor arrived with an almost unbearable symmetry, the same kind of early vicious storm that had taken Naomi Calder 3 winters before, and when the pain started 6 weeks ahead of anyone's reckoning, panic moved through the Whitfield house faster than any midwife could have followed it. Dr. Whitfield, so composed and authoritative in the daylight hours of his practice, went to pieces the moment his own wife's screaming began in earnest, his hands shaking too badly to be of any use, his medical training abandoning him entirely in the face of a fear too personal to hold at any professional distance. The baby had turned wrong somewhere in the last difficult weeks, feet where the head should be. A breach Margaret's own aging body was struggling to manage even before the contractions turned violent and close together. Whitfield sent his hired boy out into the storm for the only other person in the county who might know what to do, a retired army surgeon 11 miles east who, by cruel coincidence, had left for the territorial capital that very week and would not be back for a fortnight. By the second hour of hard labor, with Margaret's screams carrying clear across the yard and the storm worsening by the minute, someone in that panicked house finally said the name everyone had been too proud or too frightened to say first. The name of the woman the whole town had spent 2 years calling barren and foreign and unfit for decent company, the only other person within reach who had ever, by every quiet and desperate account, whispered after midnight over the years, actually saved a woman's life in a birth gone wrong. Whitfield, gray-faced and desperate now, in a way pride could no longer afford to indulge, told his hired boy to ride for the Calder Ranch, praying with a fervor he hadn't managed in years that the woman he had personally slighted more than once across the years would still be willing to come. Outside, the wind had already begun stripping shingles loose from the barn roof, and somewhere in the panicked house a mantel clock kept its indifferent count of minutes that neither mother nor child could afford to lose. Each tick a small, merciless reminder of how quickly a storm like this one had already proven it could take everything a person loved and leave nothing behind but a fenced plot and a name carved into stone. The hired boy nearly didn't make it, his horse going down twice in drifts higher than its knees, and by the time he reached the Calder Ranch, half frozen and barely coherent, he could do little more than gasp out Margaret Whitfield's name, and the word breach before Rourke was already moving, saddling his own horse before the boy had finished falling off his. He did not ask Isol whether she would come. He simply told her, pulling her cloak from its peg himself and pressing it into her hands, that the town needed her and that he intended to ride beside her through every mile of the storm to make certain she arrived safely, and that no one, doctor or councilman, or Adelie Marsh herself, so much as raised a word against her once she got there. Isol stood a long, suspended moment with the cloak heavy in her hands, feeling the old, familiar pull of every humiliation this particular family had never personally delivered, but had certainly permitted: the church steps, the well, the general store's cold silence. None of it committed by Margaret Whitfield directly, but all of it happening under a town Edmund Whitfield had done nothing to soften on her behalf. She thought, briefly and honestly, of refusing, of letting the town that had scorned her discover exactly how much it needed the woman it had spent 2 years discarding. The thought lasted the length of a single breath before her grandmother's voice rose up inside her, steady across an ocean and a decade, reminding her that the measure of a healer's hands was never the character of the patient, but the fact of the need, and that to withhold help from a suffering woman as punishment for a husband's sins would make her no better than the town that had wronged her. She took the cloak. She swung up behind Rourke on the black horse without further argument, gripped his coat against the wind already screaming down off the ridge, and rode with him into the worst of the storm, toward a house that had never once opened its door to her in daylight, understanding, as the ranch lights disappeared behind them into the white, that whatever happened in the hours ahead would decide, for good, exactly what Larkspur Crossing believed a barren foreign woman's hands were worth. Behind them, the Calder Ranch lights guttered once and vanished entirely into the swirling white, and Isul found herself praying in 2 languages at once, one for Margaret Whitfield's life and the child fighting to enter a world already this cruel to it, and one, quieter and harder to admit even to herself, for whatever fragile and unnamed thing had begun growing between herself and the silent man whose coat she gripped against the screaming wind. They arrived at the Whitfield house to find Ottilie Marsh already there ahead of them, summoned by some other frightened neighbor to sit with Margaret in her husband's stead. And when Isul came through the door, with snow still crusted in her hair and Rourke's coat around her shoulders, Ottilie's face went through 3 distinct expressions in the space of a single second: disbelief, calculation, and finally, grudging and furious, resignation. There was no time left for pride on either side. Margaret's screams from the back bedroom had taken on a different, more frightening quality in the last quarter hour, the sound of a body running out of the strength to fight. And Dr. Whitfield himself met Isolde in the hallway, looking a decade older than he had that morning, his composure entirely gone, his hands still shaking too badly to be trusted near a scalpel or a newborn's fragile neck. He did not apologize for the years of small cruelties, the cold silences at the general store, the sermons that had never once named her, but had somehow always managed to be about her. There was no time for that reckoning yet, and both of them understood it. He simply asked, in a voice gone raw with fear, whether she could save his wife, and Isul, already rolling her sleeves and asking Dutch's wife, who had followed them in from the storm for boiling water and clean linen, told him only that she would do everything her training allowed, and that he needed to leave the room and let her work uninterrupted. Ottilie moved to object, some final reflexive assertion of her own authority over what happened in a respectable house, and Rourke, standing just behind Isul's shoulder, with his coat still dripping snowmelt onto the floorboards, told her in a voice that left no room for further argument that the only person in this house whose judgment mattered tonight was the one already elbow-deep in preparation to save 2 lives. Larkspur Crossing had very nearly let a blizzard in its own prejudice take. Ottilie, for once in her life, said nothing at all. Isolde stepped into the back bedroom, found Margaret Whitfield gray with exhaustion and terror, the baby's small feet already visible, and the cord's danger evident to any trained eye, and set her hands to work with the same steadiness that had once saved a boy's shattered arm by lamplight, praying in Korean under her breath, the same prayer her grandmother had taught her for every birth that came too hard. The breach took every ounce of skill Isolde possessed, and several she was not entirely certain she had ever been taught, working the child's small body free by increments, turning and easing and coaxing where force would have killed them both, while Margaret, past screaming now and reduced to a low, exhausted moaning, gripped the bed frame hard enough to split a fingernail and did exactly as Isul instructed in a voice she kept low and level despite the terror climbing her own spine with every passing minute. Outside the bedroom door, Rourke stood like a wall between the room and the rest of the house, refusing entry to Ottilie's second and third attempts to insert herself into the crisis, refusing even Dr. Whitfield himself when the man's nerve finally broke entirely and he tried to force his way back in to see for himself. Twice the cord threatened to choke off the child's chance at breath entirely, and twice Isolde's hands, steadier than she had any right to feel, given the ice still in her bones from the ride-over, found the angle that saved him until at last, in the deep, breathless hour before dawn, a thin, furious cry split the tension of the whole house at once, and Isolde lifted a small, red, unmistakably living boy into the lamplight and laid him, still slick and screaming against his mother's chest. Margaret wept in a way that had nothing left of fear in it. The afterbirth came clean, the bleeding slowed under Isol's careful pressure, and the poultice she'd carried in her bag since the ranch. And by the time the storm outside began, at last, to thin toward gray morning light, both mother and child were breathing steady and warm beneath every blanket the house could produce. Isol sat back on her heels, hands shaking now for the first time all night with the simple animal exhaustion of a crisis survived, and looked up to find Rourke in the doorway, having finally allowed himself entry, watching her with an expression she did not yet have the courage to name. Beyond him, through the frost-caked window, she could see lanterns bobbing up the road from town, neighbors drawn by the boy Whitfield had sent out hours before with news of the crisis, arriving now to discover exactly whose hands had kept their doctor's family alive through the worst night Larkspur Crossing had seen in years. And Isol understood, watching those lights approach, that whatever came next for her in this town would be decided in the next few hours, in full daylight, where no one could pretend afterward not to have seen it. By full light, the Whitfield yard had filled with half the town, drawn by rumor and lantern light and the particular hunger a small community always has for witnessing a crisis resolve itself. And Isol stood on the porch in a borrowed shawl, bone-tired and still faintly trembling, watching Larkspur Crossing arrive to discover the truth of what had happened in the night. Dr. Whitfield, composed again now that the danger had passed, but visibly humbled in a way his neighbors had never once seen from him, walked out onto that same porch in front of the gathering crowd, and did something none of them, least of all Isol, had expected. He took her hand in both of his, in full view of the church board and the sewing circle, and every family who had ever crossed the street to avoid walking near her, and thanked her, his voice cracking on the words, for saving both his wife and his son when his own training and his own town's prejudice had left him standing useless in a doorway. He said the word prejudice deliberately, Isol noted, glancing once briefly toward Ottilia Marsh at the edge of the crowd, and the crowd's murmur at the word carried an edge that told her the town's collective memory of the last 2 years had, in one long night, become suddenly and uncomfortably vivid to itself. Ottilia's face had gone the color of old paper. She did not step forward to defend herself, did not offer the sharp retort Isol had half expected out of pure habit, and when one of her own sewing circle friends turned to look at her with an expression that had shifted, overnight, from solidarity to something closer to shame, Ottilie simply turned and walked toward her own wagon without a word, the first genuine retreat Isol had ever witnessed from her in 2 years of small cruelties. Someone in the crowd, an old rancher's wife who had never once spoken to Isol beyond a curt nod at the general store, stepped forward and asked quietly whether she might come by sometime and ask a few questions about a persistent cough troubling her youngest grandchild. Another followed. By the time the crowd finally began to disperse back toward town in the thin morning light, Isol had been asked, in the space of 20 minutes, more direct and respectful questions about her knowledge than the whole town had offered her in 2 combined years. And she stood on that porch feeling something loosen in her chest that she had carried so long she had nearly forgotten it as a separate weight from her own bones. Rourke found her at the edge of the yard once the crowd had thinned, standing apart the way she always seemed to, even now, even after a night that had changed, visibly and permanently, how this town intended to treat her. He did not say anything grand. He simply stood beside her, watching the same thinning crowd she watched, and after a long moment told her, in a voice pitched low enough that it belonged only to the two of them, that Naomi would have liked her, would have recognized in her the same quiet stubbornness that had once made his own family's disapproval feel like weather rather than a verdict worth heeding. It was the first time he had spoken his late wife's name to Isol, without the old grief cracking his voice in the process. And Isol understood the offering for what it was, not a replacement, not a forgetting, but a widening of the small fenced plot beneath the cottonwoods to make room for someone new to stand there beside him, without displacing the person already resting inside it. She told him quietly that her own grandmother would have approved of him too, in her own way, would have called him a man whose silence carried honesty rather than emptiness, the highest compliment her grandmother had ever paid to anyone. They stood together at the edge of the Whitfield yard a while longer, not touching, close enough that the space between them had stopped feeling like distance and started feeling, instead, like a held breath, both of them watching the last of the lanterns disappear back toward town. Somewhere behind them, Dr. Whitfield's newborn son let out a thin, healthy cry through the still open window, the sound of a life that had very nearly ended before it began, saved now and squalling with the particular fury of the newly living. Isul felt something in her chest answer that cry, an old ache reshaping itself, slowly into something closer to peace than grief. She did not know yet what shape her life in Larkspur Crossing would take, now that the town had finally seen her clearly, whether the shift she'd witnessed on that porch would hold through the ordinary cruelty of an ordinary Tuesday, or whether Ottilie Marsh's retreat had been humility or merely the temporary silence of a woman regrouping. She did not know either exactly what Rourke intended by standing this close to her, with his hand not quite touching hers, though some part of her, tired and hopeful in equal measure, suspected she was about to find out. The weeks that followed did not transform Larkspur Crossing into a town without prejudice, because no single night, however dramatic, ever fully unmakes 2 years of small cruelties woven into a community's ordinary habits. But the shift Isul had felt on the Whitfield porch proved sturdier than she'd dared hope. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to ask after remedies for their children's coughs. The general store's silence, when the bell rang for her now, had thinned into something closer to ordinary commerce, still cool in places, but no longer freezing. The church board, after considerable and reportedly heated debate, voted to formally recognize her as the county's registered midwife, a designation that came with a modest stipend, and, more importantly to Isul, a legal standing no rumor or gossip could easily strip away again. Ottilie Marsh never delivered the public apology some in town seemed to expect after the scene on the Whitfield porch, but she stopped speaking Isul's name in the register of insults she'd used for 2 years, and once, crossing paths at the well where the whole trouble had first crystallized, she offered a stiff, wordless nod that Isul chose, deliberately, to accept as the closest thing to contrition a woman like Ottilie Marsh was ever likely to manage. It was not forgiveness exactly, on either side. It was simply the quiet, unglamorous work of two people learning to occupy the same small town without active cruelty between them, which Isul had learned over a hard 2 years to recognize as its own kind of victory. Dutch's youngest daughter took to calling her Auntie Isul without anyone having suggested it, a small, unearned honorific that undid Isul more thoroughly than any of the town's larger apologies ever could. And on the evenings, she still rode out to the Calder Ranch, no longer strictly for wages owed, but because it had somewhere in the last difficult season become simply where she wanted to be. She found herself standing at that same fence rail with Rourke, watching the light go copper over the range, feeling for the first time in longer than she could measure that the word home might, cautiously, be one she was allowed to use again. By the time the first green came up stubborn and defiant through the thawing ground the following spring, on land the whole town had once dismissed as barren. Alongside the woman who worked it, Isul Yoon stood at the small fenced plot beneath the cottonwoods in a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Rourke had brought back from the county seat without telling her why. Half Korean embroidery and half frontier calico, exactly the two halves of the life she had finally stopped apologizing for living. The wedding was small by any account, held at the ranch rather than the church, though the Reverend came willingly enough this time, and Dutch stood as witness with his daughter clutching a fistful of the season's first wildflowers, and Dr. Whitfield and Margaret arrived with their son bundled against the spring wind, the boy whose first cry Isul had coaxed into the world with her own 2 hands. Ottilie Marsh came too, uninvited by any formal letter, but present nonetheless at the edge of the gathering, and left, before the vows were even spoken, a small jar of preserves on the porch rail, wordless and imperfect and, Isul decided, exactly enough. Rourke Calder, a man the whole territory had once feared for the men he'd buried and the silence he kept, said his vows in a voice steady enough to carry across the whole yard, and when he spoke of choosing her, publicly, permanently, in front of every person who had once called her unworthy of exactly this, Isul understood that the word Barren had finally, fully lost its power over her. Not because the ground had changed, but because she had planted herself somewhere that finally let her grow. That evening, standing together at the fence rail one more time, as the sky went the particular gold it only turned in the last hour before dark, Rourke asked her, quietly, whether she had any regrets left about the life the two of them had built out of 2 separate griefs, and one very stubborn ledger of debt. Isolde told him no, not one, and meant it entirely. If a story like this one has ever made you believe that the people who scorn you today are not the ones who get to decide your worth tomorrow, tell us in the comments which moment struck you hardest, and if you want more stories of quiet women who outlasted every insult thrown at them and found the home they were always owed. Subscribe, because there are many more like Isolde waiting to be told.